The story begins in 1940, when Army officer John was captured and ordered to sign a document stating that he was a spy. Since this accusation was false, John refused to sign. At that moment, his captors brought in John's wife. The soldiers had tortured her so severely that she too was now confessing to the claim that John was a spy. Subsequently, many prisoners were sent to a labor camp. They were informed that the entire region served as their prison. Because the area was completely surrounded by snow, anyone attempting to escape would not survive. A bounty was also placed on the heads of fugitives, meaning that even the local inhabitants would kill them on sight. All the prisoners then had their heads shaved, and when mealtime arrived that night, they received very meager rations. Due to vitamin deficiencies, many of the men began to suffer from poor night vision. Then, a man named Smith accidentally dropped a small amount of his food. A desperate prisoner immediately lunged for it, but Smith quickly stepped on his food to protect it. John felt pity for the man and gave him his own food. Upon seeing this, Smith warned him, "Being too compassionate will cost you dearly here, buddy. It could cost you your life." After Smith had left, a prisoner named Roy told John that he was an American and that he had been captured and thrown into prison for that reason alone. John replied, "I too have been framed on false charges, brother." Roy laughed and responded, "I just acted in the wrong movie. That is my crime." Inside, we then see a prisoner named Waka who was gambling. Roy told John about him, explaining that he was a dangerous criminal whom the guards never stopped from doing whatever he pleased. Consequently, everyone feared him. Several other prisoners had been captured to serve as slave laborers. John then began to ask, "So, brother, what would one have to do to escape from you?" But Roy said, "That's impossible, brother." He warned him, "You won't make it out alive." But at that very moment, Waka demanded a prisoner's sweater. When the man refused, Waka pulled out a knife and stabbed him. Then another prisoner took off his own sweater and handed it to Waka, thereby, in a sense, settling the gambling debts he had lost. Days went by, and John gradually adapted himself to the ways of the camp. The prisoners were forced to work in the snow, mining for coal and cutting wood. However, they were given very little food, and their sleeping quarters offered absolutely no warmth.
They were denied even basic necessities like new clothes and shoes. One night, John discovered lice in his clothing, and Roy remarked, "I have an old home remedy for this." He told John, "Come outside with me." But just then, they suddenly heard the sound of an explosion. They soon realized that a blast had occurred within the coal mine. While Roy was burying his clothes in the snow, John stood gazing at the tower, contemplating an escape. Roy revealed, "I have a friend named Lazarus. He can help us get out of here." Following this, they began discussing a plan and decided that if they managed to escape and kept heading south, they would eventually reach Mongolia. However, for such a long journey, they would need to stockpile food and also wait for the weather to warm up, as the harsh snow would surely kill them. Subsequently, Roy began trading cigarettes for food, which he then hid beneath the loose wooden floorboards. John checked the buried clothes and observed that all the lice had indeed congregated there. Sometime later, the guards attempted to march the prisoners out to work. However, due to a fierce blizzard, walking became nearly impossible, and several men began to collapse. The guards allowed the prisoners to lie down for a brief respite, callously remarking, "We don't care if you die." When Smith voiced a complaint, a gun was immediately leveled at his head. Yet, ignoring the guard, he began walking toward the forest. The guards then proceeded to lead all the prisoners deeper into the woods. The prisoners quickly gathered some timber to construct a makeshift shelter and urged Smith to join them. The following day, among all the prisoners, Smith and John were selected for work in the coal mine. There, they suffered from incessant coughing, as breathing in the stifling air was incredibly difficult. Moreover, the mine tunnels were prone to sudden collapses at any moment. Due to the lack of oxygen, John collapsed, and as he lost consciousness, he felt as though he had finally arrived back home. Lost in his delusion, he began heading toward his home, just as the guard stood fully prepared to shoot him. Fortunately, Smith pulled him back in the nick of time.
Expressing his gratitude, John confided in him about his escape plan. However, Smith warned him that Roy had been duping people for years. He pulled the same trick on every new prisoner who arrived. Nevertheless, John remained adamant about escaping, and Smith agreed to join him. That night, John dragged Roy out of his bed to demonstrate that the storm was raging so fiercely that it would completely obliterate their footprints, making it the perfect time for them to leave. But Roy stubbornly insisted that it was impossible, offering excuses about their meager food supplies. This made John wonder if the man was actually trying to fool him. Just then, however, Waka spotted the two of them, so they quickly retreated back inside. Meanwhile, Andres discovered that a prisoner named Kazik was concealing a condition that rendered him blind at night. Kazik swore that his vision was perfectly fine during the day, adding, "At night, I'll just hold onto your shoulder.
What's the big deal? He implored Andres to keep his secret so that he too could remain a part of the escape plan. In the meantime, Smith handed his gold watch to Lazar so that the latter could use it to gather vital intelligence regarding their escape. Lazar subsequently revealed that in order to flee, they would need to shut down the generator. This would plunge the area into 10 minutes of absolute darkness, making their escape significantly easier. This operation would have to be executed precisely during the changing of the guards' shifts. As they waited for the opportune moment, Waka suddenly lunged at John, pressing a knife against his throat, as he confessed that he owed a massive debt to some gamblers. For this very reason, he too was desperate to escape. With a knife held against his neck, John was in no position to refuse. He had no choice but to let them join the group. As soon as the designated time arrived, the prisoners cut the wires, shut down the generator, and made their escape. The alarm blared instantly, but thanks to the raging storm, the guards could see nothing, and not a single footprint of the escapees remained. He ventured into the forest with his dogs, hoping that their keen noses would eventually track down the fugitives. The 7 prisoners were running through the woods as fast as their legs could carry them. Before long, they became so exhausted that pressing onward became nearly impossible. At that moment, John, panting heavily, reminded them that dogs run much faster than humans. They had to keep moving. They attempted to push forward once again, but the swirling snow had begun to blind them. Consequently, they started searching for a place to take cover. John, however, refused to stop, reasoning that the very same blizzard hindering them must surely be holding back the guards as well. He then borrowed Waka's knife, and by stripping bark from the trees, fashioned a makeshift mask to shield his face from the snow. Now he was able to proceed without any difficulty. Sometime later, when the storm finally subsided, they sat down to rest and gathered all their remaining food supplies. It was then that John noticed Waka wearing Roy's jacket. Waka then revealed that Roy had been on the verge of betraying them.
But I forced him into silence and brought back all the food he had hoarded. Later, when they resumed their journey, Smith whispered to John that taking Waka along was akin to making a pact with the devil. Shortly thereafter, they suddenly heard the sound of screams in the distance, but it turned out to be nothing more than wolves. Days turned into weeks, and John, drawing upon his training as best he could, began navigating their path by observing the direction of the sun. Witnessing this, Waka was greatly impressed. He told John, "No matter what happens, brother, I will stand by you. These people may speak ill of me, but pay them no mind." Later, when they paused to rest, John realized that it would take them another 3 or 4 weeks to reach the nearby lake. However, they had only 1 week's worth of food remaining. Consequently, they would have to hunt or fish to survive. Waka proposed raiding a village situated alongside some fields, but the others unanimously rejected the idea. Meanwhile, Kazakh went off to gather firewood. However, night fell before he could return, and in the darkness, he lost his bearings. The poor fellow had become lost in the forest. He wandered aimlessly in search of the way back, but the biting cold soon caused him to begin hallucinating. Suddenly, he imagined he saw his old teacher standing nearby, and a city appeared in the distance. He believed that at long last they had reached civilization, but when the others went out to search for him, they were devastated to discover that Kazakh had frozen to death just a few meters away from their camp. They buried him and offered prayers for the repose of his soul. Waka, however, merely remarked that there was now one less mouth to feed.
After freshening up a bit, they began making their way toward the border. As they traversed the forest, they started to feel as though someone was following them. With great cunning, they cornered the individual, and Waka nearly attacked them. However, John stopped him just in the nick of time. The mysterious figure turned out to be a young Polish woman named Irina. The poor girl, much like them, was fleeing from somewhere herself and had been following them in hopes of finding food and safety. John wanted to take her along, but the others objected, arguing that they didn't have enough food to spare and that being a woman, she would inevitably slow down their pace. Sometime later, they came across an animal stuck in the mud, which became their dinner for the night. However, Andres, having spotted something behind them, separated from the group. He returned that evening, accompanied by Irina. The following morning, they mixed together various ingredients to create a makeshift soap and finally washed their clothes. They also took the opportunity to shave thoroughly. Waka, however, refused their assistance and proceeded to trim his beard by himself. A while later, they discovered that a section of the lake was frozen over. The ice appeared thin and fragile. Nevertheless, Irina managed to sprint across it and reach the other side. Seeing this, the others followed suit. They slipped and fell several times along the way, but fortunately, everyone made it safely to the opposite shore. Now, as they continued through the forest, Smith asked Irina about her past. She began to recount how Russian soldiers had killed her parents. However, Smith noticed several inconsistencies in her emotional story. Deep down, he realized the girl was lying, as her accent clearly indicated that she hailed from a
When my brother died in that orphanage, I decided to escape. The next day, they resumed their journey. However, they eventually reached a spot along the way that was swarming with mosquitoes. Consequently, everyone's faces became swollen and disfigured. When they saw some locals passing by, they noticed that the mosquitoes were not attacking them. Fearing capture, they were forced to remain in hiding. But Zoran ventured out to ask one of the men for the secret behind this. The man then placed a necklace around his neck, an amulet that repelled the mosquitoes, after which everyone was able to continue their journey in peace. Days passed, and Irina spoke with each of them individually, learning their stories. Andres had once been a priest. Tomas was a pastry chef who aspired to become an actor. Zoran was an accountant who, in a moment of thoughtlessness, had taken a photograph of a government building, leading to his arrest on charges of espionage. And Smith was an engineer who had come to Russia in search of work. When he was arrested, his son was shot dead. The next time they stopped to rest, Irina used a strip of fabric from her skirt to clean the wounds on Smith's feet. Soon, they reached a set of railway tracks, and John calculated that it would take approximately 4 days to reach the border, though the area was known to be heavily populated with farmers and guards. Therefore, they realized they had to cross this stretch before nightfall. While they were waiting, Volka kept staring intently at his amulet. Suddenly, Zoran made a mocking remark about it, and Volka immediately lunged at him, forcing the others to intervene and break up the altercation. A few hours later, everyone was jubilant as they finally crossed the border and entered Mongolia. However, Volka declared, "I will remain in Russia." He and John shook hands one last time before parting ways. Now, the rest of the group continued their journey through the desert, heading toward the city. Everyone was overjoyed, yet before long, the mood turned somber once again. Then they spotted a sign announcing that Mongolia was now under Russian control. Consequently, the poor souls decided to remain in the desert rather than proceed to the city. They subsequently sought out a Buddhist temple, reasoning that the Marxists would not practice any form of discrimination. They entered immediately. However, the place lay in utter ruin. After unearthing several skulls buried in the ground, Andreas revealed that the exact same thing had happened in Russia. Priests had been shot or arrested.
And when he caught sight of the church, he flew into a rage and killed a young guard. Everyone began discussing what course of action to take, and eventually reached the decision that their only hope of survival lay in reaching India. However, to get there, they would have to cross China. For the next few weeks, they trudged through the desert under the scorching sun. One day, they were suddenly surrounded by a group of horsemen. They identified themselves as Americans on their way to Tibet. Fortunately, the horsemen believed them and rode away without saying a word. A short while later, a young horseman returned, sent by the others to offer them water. Days passed, and to shield themselves from the sun, they continued their journey with their heads and feet covered by twigs and scraps of cloth. They rationed their water with extreme care, yet eventually it ran out. Just then, Smith spotted some trees in the distance. But John tried to convince him that he was merely hallucinating and urged everyone to keep moving south. When Smith became increasingly agitated, the others decided to calm him down and follow his lead. After walking for some time, they spotted a bird flying overhead, proving that Smith had not been hallucinating after all. Overjoyed, they began running as fast as they could and finally discovered a well. They drank their fill of water and set up camp right there for the night. The next morning, having filled every bottle and container they could find, they resumed their journey southward. A few days later, when they encountered a sandstorm, everyone panicked and scrambled toward a nearby ravine. They remained hidden until the storm had passed. Fortunately, everyone survived, but they lost all their water. In the days that followed, Irene and Tomas fell gravely ill. Consequently, Smith began suggesting that they return to the well. But John pointed out the impossibility of the task, asking, how are we supposed to figure out which direction the well lies in?
But this was his last painting, as he too died afterward. Burying him there, the group moved on. A few days later, John saw distant hills and suggested they go there to find water. Smith was so exhausted, he couldn't even move. He told them to leave him. John sent Joran and Andreas ahead, while he stayed with Smith, who had fallen. By evening, John had dragged Smith back to their camp. Unfortunately, they still hadn't found any water. The next morning, Joran woke up to the sensation of a snake crawling between his legs. He followed the snake and found a small watering hole. The men bent down to drink water and even poured some into Smith's mouth as he couldn't move. Then they killed the snake and cooked it for lunch. While eating, Andreas lost one of his teeth. That night, Smith told John to leave him alone, but John said, "As long as you're alive, we won't leave you." During their conversation, John said, "I want to see my wife again, no matter what." The poor woman had been tortured terribly by the soldiers. Her story touched Smith's heart. The next day, he got up to move on, and soon they found a river. This gave them enough strength to move towards the hills, and finally, after crossing the Great Wall of China, they reached the Himalayan mountains. In these snowy hills, they found a small sign indicating Tibet. In those snowy hills, they found a monk who told them that India was near and took them to a nearby Buddhist monastery. They finally found real food after such a long time. There, the monk's leader said, "If you want to go to India, wait a little. Let the cold pass. You won't survive the blizzard." Before going to sleep, John said, "We should leave. We'll be safe in India," but the others were frightened by his words.
He wanted to stay right there. Then they began discussing their futures. Andreas wanted to join the fight against Germany and Russia. Joran wanted me to get the photographs taken by Tomas published in a newspaper. He wanted to tell the world our story. Poor John, however, could not return to Poland, and so he simply wanted to keep moving. Smith, meanwhile, wanted to go back home to America. He declared, "I'm heading toward China." Max had promised them, "We have a contact. We can get you to America." The next morning, John decided to press on alone. When Joran and Andreas spotted him, they bade a final farewell to Smith and set off after their friend. Sometime later, the three of them finally reached India. The people of India welcomed them with great warmth and offered them assistance. For the next 50 years, John had no fixed abode. But then, at long last, Poland regained its independence. John sought out his old home and unlocked the door using a hidden key. As he stepped inside, he was overcome with joy, for his wife was waiting there for him. So, how did you like this beautiful story? Be sure to let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.